Your Highness, Excellencies, Ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the WISE special session on innovative financing for education to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. The theme of today's session is extremely important because improving education access and quality is a topic that concerns us all. In the context of the current financial crisis, the international community will have to use all available resources for education in more effective and innovative ways. At a time when developed countries are running deficits, new sources of financing and investing in education must be created. Your presence here today is to exchange ideas, share best practices in order to reinforce and coordinate current efforts and to identify the most useful and realistic ideas and help develop them into concrete initiatives. To guide the discussions around this important topic, our panel of distinguished personalities includes Her Highness Sheikh Hamouza bint Nasser. Her Highness is known to uphold quality education, which is for her the key to unleashing human potential. She is a leading advocate for education and a relentless campaigner for children's and youth right to quality education. Through her work as a UNESCO Special Envoy for Basic and Higher Education and as a member of the MDG's advocacy group, Sheikh Hamouza has brought worldwide attention to the plight of out-of-school children, especially those living in areas affected by wars, conflicts, and instability. Her contributions make her an inspiring leader in a region where women still struggle to take risks and make an impact. Ms. Carol Bellamy. She's a tireless defender of children's rights and currently she's the chair of the board of directors of the Global Partnership Fund, previously known as the Education for All Fast Track Initiative. Ms. Bellamy previously served 10 years as executive director of UNICEF. Senator Cristóvão Buarque. Senator Buarque is a former Minister of Education in Brazil. He is behind the successful implementation of conditional cash transfer schemes for education in Brazil, and currently he is a senator in the Brazilian National Congress. Ms. Rita Roy, she's the president and CEO of the MasterCard Foundation, an independent private foundation based in Toronto, Canada. The foundation advances innovative microfinance and youth learning strategies to promote prosperity in developing countries. I would like to inform you that this event is being live streamed through a website, WISE website, and will be receiving questions through Twitter, #WiseMDG. We will also receive questions and ideas from the audience. As a reminder, we have only 1 hour, 10 minutes left to this session. I would like kindly to ask the panelists not to exceed 5 minutes per intervention, and when the floor is open for discussion, also I would like your intervention to be under 2 minutes, please. Now we'll hear an introduction about our topic from the expert moderator of this panel, Mr. Nicholas Burnett. He's the Managing Director of Results for Development, and he's a member of the Task Force on Education of the Leading Group on Innovative Financing for Development. He previously served as Assistant Director General for Education at UNESCO. The floor is yours, Mr. Burnett.
Thank you very much. Your Highness, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We are here, I think, to discuss a very small portion of global financing on education, but a very crucial portion. Globally, something like $2.5 trillion actually is spent on education. But the international flows, aid and other types of flow for education are something around 14 billion. Only 14 out of that whole global 2.5 trillion. But that 14 is pretty influential and could be, as I hope we shall discuss, a lot more influential. Now that 14 actually breaks down into 2 elements. About 12 billion of official development assistance, which comes from donors, bilateral donors. And about 2 billion that comes from everywhere else, which are donors who are not recorded through the OECD Development Assistance Committee mechanism, which are corporations, of whom I see several in the room, which are private foundations, such as the one that Ms. Roy heads. And so the very interesting question, I think, is what what further role might that 2 billion play? And indeed, is that 2 billion a big enough number? Well, one can think that that new sources of finance and new mechanisms for cooperation internationally might want to do several things. One, of course, it ought to raise resources. And there is certainly need. The Education for All Global Monitoring Report, which looks at the financing needs simply for basic education in low-income countries, estimate a global annual gap of something like $23 billion just for that. That's clearly the MDG-related part of this session. But that's not all. The flows which already exist, the aid flows which already exist, less than half of them go for basic education. Is that the highest priority? Does enough go to Africa? Does enough go to countries with great difficulties, particularly those in or emerging from conflict? Does enough go for effective things? Does enough, in the context particularly of this conference, does enough go for innovation? And I would say the answer to all of those questions is no. And the solution to that is the influence of the other 2 billion, which I think we will probably want to agree should be more. So one of the important questions is how can these new and at this point relatively small sources of international finance not only do things themselves, but also influence the existing aid flows? How might they do that? Well, first of all, they of course should not be subtractive from the existing flows. So any new mechanism shouldn't be reallocation of money from an existing mechanism. That would not increase the net flows. Secondly, they need to, I would argue, increase the profile, the international profile of education. Because one of the reasons that, say, education does relatively poorly compared to health in terms of international flows has to do with that international profile being lower. Another reason, and this is something which these flows might also wish to do, is that the education is perceived wrongly, I would argue, as a result of being at this conference, but it is perceived, like it or not, as not being a particularly innovative sector. Whereas, say, health, again, is perceived as being extremely innovative, and of course, in some ways, is more open to technological innovations, such as new vaccines and that sort of thing. However, I think that these are the sorts of things that these new sources and new partnerships that we are going to discuss today might focus upon. And we can already see this beginning to happen. We see a big increase in aid from non-DAC donors. China, Brazil, beginning from South Africa also. We see aid from foundations increasing into education, but frankly nowhere at the level of the health sector, and partly because there's no one big donor, which there is in, one big foundation, which there is in the health sector, the Gates Foundation. We see increasing corporate flows. An interesting publication recently in the US indicated that something like $500 million comes from US corporations into international education. And we see all these things beginning. The question is, how can they be better stitched up? How can they expand? And how can they influence those other more traditional but terribly important flows? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burnett.